This morning we continue our study and our annual theme for this year of creation and evolution and the things that have not been seen, the evidence of things not seen. Us having a little spot there. And we're going to be talking about that this morning in our study. Why believe in creation? Why should I choose to believe that and not in evolution? I think I've mentioned this in a couple of our lessons before, but there is such a huge bias on this topic if you do much studying on this. For so many people, you could never show them enough evidence for them to even consider the idea of creation as a valid conclusion. For many, it seems like the idea of science removes God from the equation. And so he's not even a possibility for many people in their thinking. Though usually not stated very often, science really has become a god for so many. Evolution has become a religion, really. And when you think about it for very long, or really not very long, that's pretty well the case, because faith is ruled out, and yet faith is absolutely what's needed to believe in evolution and to go down that path. Not just faith, but great faith is required to believe that. And as we think about these things and we think about our faith, that's what we're trying to do is look at the evidence of things not seen. Where does the evidence point? What does that look like? What makes more sense when you think about our origins and what it is that we should believe? And our faith is not blind faith. It's rooted in something. The assurance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. So as we think about this morning, I hope it'll be a lesson that is an encouragement to you, as I hope all of these lessons have been. Really, every week, I hope each lesson is an encouragement. But as we think about this topic, especially, I hope it's encouraging to think about some of these things. Well, let's talk about just a little bit about the law of probability. You know, when you think about, okay, well, what's the odds, right? What's the odds of something happening? You know, even evolutionists realize that the chance of life just arising is, without God is just really astronomical. The late Carl Sagan estimated that the chance of life evolving on any given planet like Earth is 1 out of 2 billion, 1 times 10 to the 2 billion zeros. I read that would take 6,000 books of 300 pages each just to write the number. So that's a big number to think about, and one that shouldn't just be dismissed, because after all, many will look at that. If you remove God from the equation, they'll look at that and say, so you're saying there's a chance, right? Well, not really. Another estimate that the probability for chance formation of the smallest form of a living organism is 1 followed by 340 million zeros. So that's a pretty big number as well. But also, when you conclude and understand that supposedly for the number of atoms in our entire solar system, well, not the solar system, but the known universe, is supposed to be only 10 to the 80th power, it makes it all the more large to think about millions and billions of zeros. That's supposed to be the whole known universe. And again, if you remove God from the equation, then you're saying, well, there's a chance. Well, is there though? There's a law, it's called Borel's law, states that the probability of an occurrence of any event where the chances are beyond 1 followed by 50 zeros is an event that we can state with certainty will never happen, no matter how much time is allotted, nor how many conceivable opportunities there are that could exist. And so that's interesting to think about, then, just throwing out probabilities and all of that. But again, the bias is extreme. If you take God out of the equation, then people say, well, there's a chance. There's a chance, no matter how unlikely. And yet when we think about creation, when we think about all that we see around us, we can conclude, well, there's a 100% chance that there's creation, right? There's a 100% chance of all the things around us. And it should give us a great deal of a great bit of stability in our faith to think about what really makes more sense. 1 in 2 billion, that is far more than unlikely of even being a possibility, or that there is a creator. The sudden appearance of life is something that is seen in the fossil record. Life appears suddenly, it appears dramatically, and it's full. And when you think about creation, the creation account in Genesis chapter 1, you could pretty well predict that, right? God said it, and it was done. Things were created. We have the sudden appearance of life. Creation also explains a sudden disappearance of life in Genesis chapter 6 through 8 with the flood. And so that's interesting. One author whose name is James Reed, he said, it's also interesting to note that the scientific record is a bit strained to explain why the dinosaurs suddenly died out. They had supposedly spent about 140 million years adapting for survival, and then in a few short centuries disappeared. That's kind of interesting, isn't it? You have all this time that you are supposed to be evolving, and then just in a matter of a few years on the scheme of evolution, they're just gone. But the fossil record not only confirms that animals appear and remain relatively unchanged, but then they disappear abruptly. Evolution requires, of course, intermediate forms between species, and certainly paleontology just doesn't provide that. So the sudden appearance of life is good evidence for creation. We also know that life forms remain distinct. We don't see evolving species like Darwin talks about. We don't see transitional forms. We talked about in 2 or 3 lessons ago all of these so-called missing links, just how missing they really are from reality, because they've turned out to be anything but that. And so we don't have that. And yet when you think about what science is supposed to be, and belief in that, and seeing is believing, and evidence and all of that, and people, I only deal in facts. Well, what's the problem with all of that? If you want to see to believe, the problem is we don't see all of these things. But we do see what Genesis talks about in chapter 1 about the plants and the vegetation, the creatures of the deep, all the living creatures producing after their kind. And we see that taking place just as God says so. And all of these forms remain distinct from one another. Religion. The evolutionary model would predict that religion has gradually formed or gradually evolved from primitive forms to advanced forms. Of course, evolution could never explain why would man even have a religious inclination to begin with. Won't even try to talk about that, but it is interesting to think about how religion has come about and the things that are seen through archaeology and matters like that. An author named William Petrie, who wrote a book called The Religions of Ancient Egypt, he said this. He said, were the conception of a god only an evolution from such spirit worship, we would find the worship of many gods preceding the worship of one god. Polytheism would precede monotheism in each tribe and race. What we actually find is the contrary of this. Monotheism is the first stage traceable in history. Wherever we can trace polytheism to its earliest stages, we find that it results from combinations of monotheism. And so when you think about that, what is it that we see? Well, you would think with evolution, you have all of these worship to all these different gods, and then it would kind of get more concise down to one. But he's saying that's not what we see. And in fact, that's really what the Bible supports when you think about the evidence of how these things have started and what direction they have gone. In Romans chapter 1, we see exactly that. When verse 20 says, Since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculation, and their foolish heart was darkened. Look at verse 23. They exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man, and of birds and four-footed animals and crawling creatures. Then look at verse 25. For they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. What you gather from that is that God is put his creation out there. It is able to be seen. We're able to believe based upon that. And that's where it kind of all starts, a belief in God and his creation and believing in him and acting accordingly. And then what happened is, well, man, they weren't thankful. They didn't continue on in that. They exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for the image in the form of corruptible man and of beasts and all of that. And so they started worshiping that. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshiped and served the creation rather than the Creator. And so we see worship going from God to multiple things. And so that's interesting to think about, especially in light of what evolution would have you think. Civilization. We see man and his civilization in our history. We see cities and communities, the working with metal and different components like that, construction, language, and the writing of that. And all of that just kind of comes on the scene at the same time, several thousand years ago, probably starting in the Middle East, of course. And there's a lot of archaeological evidence that points to that. And we've talked about that in different lessons as well. But isn't it strange, though, to think about evolutionists and what they consider with man and him evolving, and how he's been evolving for a million years and going through these different stages, and yet man has only somehow began evolving culturally in the last several thousand years, which on the evolutionary scale is just a mere drop in the bucket. It's interesting to see that doesn't really make a lot of sense. If you had a million years, you're just now starting to do something culturally that would be a progression of such to where there would even be archaeology for that. It doesn't make sense. And yet, of course, creation, it all makes sense of it all starting at one place and going from there, as archaeology shows us. But civilization should have been progressing for the millions of years, and not just over a period of several thousand. Laws of science. We like those, right? The first law of thermodynamics. Energy can neither be created nor destroyed, only altered in form. That's interesting to think about, of course. And we know that the universe operates on matter and energy. We know that God created, and all of those things were done and accomplished. Genesis chapter 2 and verse 1, thus the heavens and the earth were completed, and all their host. God created all that we see, all that we know. And yet so often all we hear about is, the Big Bang. And we hear about all of this energy being expanded and exploded and all of that. And still there's not really an answer for where did all of that come from? How did two rocks hitting together create all of this? So the very first law of thermodynamics shows us that really doesn't make a lot of sense. But when we think about creation, God created. He did all of these things. And that's, of course, what we have. And it makes a lot more sense to think that God created and we have all that is here than it does to try to explain, well, where did all of this come from if none of this existed in the beginning? So really it doesn't make a lot of sense for that. The second law of thermodynamics, entropy always increases. I don't know. I don't even need to explain that, right? Believe me, I looked up that word several times. Entropy means the amount of disorder. And so the amount of disorder always increases. And it explains the principle of why you can't unscramble an egg. You know, you scramble an egg, and that's pretty well the way it's going to be. You don't reverse that. The process that involves the transfer of energy, the heat transfer of energy, it's not something that's reversible. And the point of this is that it always moves towards disorder. All this progression always moves towards disorder. Things over a period of time, they don't get better, they don't improve. Try that with your yard. It doesn't work that way. It gets worse. It gets more disorder than the opposite of that, which is really contrary to the theory of evolution. The idea that a universe evolved and it keeps on evolving, and somehow in that process of time continues to improve and evolve. That doesn't make any sense. Nothing else works that way. This law doesn't work that way. It shows us that things, as they go on, they get disorderly. They wear down. They wear out. We can relate to all that with our age, right? And we know that that is true. If you look over in Hebrews chapter 1, Hebrews chapter 1, verses 10 through 12 is a good point there. You, Lord, in the beginning did lay the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the works of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. They all will become old as a garment, and as a mantle you will roll them up. As a garment they will also be changed, but you are the same, and your years will not come to an end. That's interesting, isn't it? God is not going to grow old and disappear, but the earth and all the works there, they continue to grow old. The universe is that way. It's going to wear down, it's going to wear out. That's the way it was created. Evolution would have you believe the opposite, that things are getting better, things are improving. That doesn't make sense with anything else. And then simply, something cannot come from nothing. The Bible doesn't skirt the issue. It doesn't sneak around the corner and try to sweep it under the rug. Everything goes back to God. It all comes back to life beginning with God. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And yet evolution rests on the unscientific claim that something came from nothing. Life came from non-life. And there's no way of getting around that. What really takes more faith to believe? What really makes more sense? God really is the only logical cause, not only for the origin of life and the universe, but what about our emotions? What about our morality? What about our intellectual nature? Our appreciation for things that are beautiful and things that are great? Where does all that come from? Does it really make sense that just evolved or showed up somehow? Think about what can be observed. Of course, evolution in the sense of Darwin, we can't see that in a lifetime. That's never been a problem for evolutionists because they always just put as much time as is needed to then be able to say, well, if enough time is given, then this or that can take place. And as we talked about at the very beginning, God's not even a possibility, so you just give it time. And that's what they believe. But what do we observe? We don't observe those kinds of changes in our life. We don't see those things, nor do we really see any of that in the science of archaeology or paleontology or any of that. And yet every day we wake up and we see the clear beauty of the hand of God. We see his hand in creation. We see what he tells us in his word. We can observe those things and realize it doesn't make a lot of sense that this just showed up or that it just worked out to be this way. But there's something much greater in that. And the Bible, again, doesn't try to blur the issue there. It speaks very clearly about that. Psalm 19 and verse 1, the heavens are telling of the glory of God. Their expanse is declaring the work of his hands. We don't have to wonder where all this comes from. It's declaring the glory of God. We read Romans 1 and verse 20 a while ago, but when he says, since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power, his divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. We should be able to look at the universe, the earth, all the beauty around us, and make a definitive conclusion. Now, no, it doesn't tell us about the plan of salvation or anything like that, but we can see there's some great hand in all of this. It should point us to God. It should be that we can clearly see those things through what's been made. In fact, so much so that Paul says they're without excuse. There wasn't an excuse to not see it for what it was and to become unthankful and turn to all the things we read about a while ago. We can observe great things from God. In Acts chapter 14, this is the passage where the miracle is done by Paul and Barnabas, and they're ready to make sacrifices, and they're calling them, Zeus and Hermes and all of that. And Paul and Barnabas are like, whoa, we're just guys here. But one of the things that they say in verses 16 and 17 of Acts 14, they say, in the generations gone by, he permitted all the nations to go their own ways, and yet he did not leave himself without witness, in that he did good, gave you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness. God has always been there doing good for the people, even those that were worshiping idols and other false gods and doing all of these things. He still left a witness to be seen, all the things of creation that could be seen by others. The universe is a masterpiece. It's not chaos. And when you think about what we can even know about the universe, there's intention that's there. There's design that's there. There's a plan by an intelligent creator. There is one with purpose that's there. The earth and the sun and the stars, the universe, all the variety of seasons that we have, demonstrate that there is the existence of something, and that it's not just a series of chance. How can the order of nature arise from chaos and chance? It really doesn't make a lot of sense. Wouldn't you think, if it's just chaos and chance, that every once in a while spring would come in November? Or every once in a while winter would start in June? Just every once in a while. You would think that there would be something like that, and yet we see things we can count on. We see the seasons change. Sure, there's temperature fluctuations here and there and all of that, but we can count on that. Wouldn't you think there'd be a little variety in gravity and how that affects us at different times? Wouldn't you think there would be some variation? Yet there's order and there's design. There's things we can count on like that. The universe is a masterpiece, not the result of chaos. Divine engineering. There's a book called The Fall of Unbelief written by Roger Dixon. And what he points out is that the survival of the fittest idea, how you get to the fittest is kind of an interesting thing, because the fittest is a matter of evolution and chance and the survival of such to produce the best. But how do you get to that best? And he said that an important difficulty in the theory of natural selection is the fact that many useful characteristics would be liabilities instead of assets while they're still in an incompleted state of development. And so getting to that point of being better, what happens through all of that? How would that survive if it was a process instead of the end result of being something great? He says the survival of the fittest tells nothing about the arrival of the fittest. I thought that was a pretty good line. The survival of the fittest tells nothing about the arrival of the fittest. And so when we think about creation, there's a reason that animals can adapt, not evolve into other species, but adapt. That's precisely because God created them that way. He created plants and animals with an ability to adapt and to be flexible. Man is the same way. We continue to survive in a world not because we unconsciously grew thumbs, but because God created us that way in the first place. And so there is divine engineering that we should be thankful for. The last point I want to make this morning is not so much about uh, why believe in creation versus evolution, but just thinking about the positive effects of creation. You know, when you think about what it means to have a creator, what it means to believe in that, where our thoughts and our focus go, what that means for our individual lives, the lives of our family, ultimately our nation and the world, the positive effects of that are great, because when man and woman live with the image of being created in God's image and thinking about where we came from in those regards and having an understanding that one day we're going to give an account for how we live. One day we're going to have to answer for the lives that we live. That has a great effect on our behavior, and it makes the world a better place. Thinking about there being a creator, thinking about our design, and ultimately what's going to happen at the end of all of that. We talked about last week in Galatians chapter 5, the fruit of Christianity, the fruit being love, joy, peace, the fruit of the Spirit, that kindness, that goodness, that patience, that unselfishness. All of that is important as a result of seeing God in what he has done, with our being the creation of his great and mighty work. But I also want you to think about the opposite of that. Think about the fruit of evolution. What does that really bring about by way of man's thinking of things? When you look at the world around you, when you see the situation in so many places, and just how terrible things are, is it not because of this kind of belief? The fruit of evolution, man is given a way to escape responsibility. He's given a way to not have to worry about serving God, not have to worry about his fellow man. Survival of the fittest. You look out for yourself. You don't worry about anybody else. Is it any wonder why so many are that way? They don't have to worry about morality. They don't have to worry about what it is that they're doing. They escape any kind of accountability before God, because after all, there is no God, and they just evolve that way. Is there really such a thing as evil? How could there be if we just evolved? That's just nature. It's just science. If we just evolved from an animal, then how does one animal sin against another? That's just the circle of life, right? That's just the way that works. There would not be any kind of evil. Who are you to say something is evil? If there's no morality, there's no standard, there's no God. It's just who can get one up on the next person, because we're just all the same, evolved by chance. That's a pretty big fruit of evolution. Sin is justifiable. Can you really even say anything about the word sin? Because there would be no such thing. Survival of the fittest, murder, suicide, genocide, whatever. It doesn't matter, because there is no sin. There is no justification needed. You're just doing what's natural. And it's just a product of this kind of teaching. Your conscience, you don't have to worry about that. Evolution gives the doer of evil, if you can call it that, a relief from their conscience, because there is no such thing, really. You can be as dishonest as you want to be. You can be as corrupt as you want to be. You can treat your fellow man however you want, because after all, how can you not rationalize that? You're just someone who has evolved, and there's nothing more than that. Evil, whatever that is, can just be called anything. It can be called good. It can be called whatever, because there shouldn't even be a classification as such, because evolution, we just were brought up through this chaos. Evolution is certainly the foundation that upholds suffering. When people don't have a purpose, when they don't have any higher goals, when they have nothing that they're really living for, when they're being told over and over that you're just an animal, a more highly evolved animal, but you're just that. Should we be surprised that people act that way? And what it does is it upholds this idea of my way, my will, my desires. If I have the power to inflict such, why can't I do that? And that's been the way through our man's history with whatever bad thing you can think about, whatever terrible dictator and terrible situation, all the suffering that some people have caused. Does it not really go back to that? I can, therefore, why shouldn't I? Because there is no God, there is no standard, no issue of morality, and I'm not going to be held accountable because that just doesn't happen. So if I can do it, I should do it. And of course, lots of suffering goes on because of that. All of that to get us to think about that the idea of creation versus evolution has a big effect in our own lives and the lives of the world around us. When we see all the evil that goes on around us, is it not any wonder because of how this is so often viewed and skewed in our society? But what I want us to see this morning and end with this morning is that's not the way we should look at things. We should be seeing things in the very fact that it makes a lot more sense that there's a creator. It takes a lot less faith to believe that there's this evidence that we can see and that we can grab hold of, and that the evidence is not in support of just blind chance and all of this and taking place randomly and all this chaos, but the fact that God has a plan. He has a will, and he has done those things. That makes a lot more sense with the world we see around us, the order and the design, our creation, the way that we are ourselves, to show that God loves us, has a purpose for us, and desires us to live differently than just by the instinct of our will to be better than anybody else, that we actually have purpose and design. I hope this morning, as we think about some of these things, that it makes us appreciate all the more what we have around us, one another, that we are there for one another, and the very fact that God sent Jesus to die upon the cross, that he desires us to be with him for eternity, that we serve an all-powerful, loving God who didn't just put chaos into motion, but rather created us with a purpose and with design, and desires for us to be with him for all eternity. This morning, if your life is not right with the Lord, we hope you'll change that. Become a child of God this very day. If you're not a Christian, become one. If you are a child of God but not living the right kind of life, you have the opportunity to get back on the right path this very day. If we can help in any way, please let it be known by coming forward. Together we stand and sing.
Who will follow Jesus, standing for the bride, holding up his banner?